Started. Welcome everyone to our seminar series on what it means to be human with Professor Carter Snead. I'm Kristen Collier, and on behalf of the University of Michigan Medical School Program on Health, Spirituality, and Religion, and the University of Michigan Bur Oak Foundation, I'm thrilled to welcome you all to what we hope will be a series of thought-provoking sessions with Professor Snead. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce my co-host for this evening, Dr. Joe Bouthiel. He's the president of the University of Michigan Bur Oak Foundation. He's going to tell us a bit more about our co-sponsor, Bur Oak. Joe?
Thanks, Kristen. On behalf of the Bur Oak Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to our first seminar series for 2022, co-hosted with the University of Michigan Medical School Program on Health, Spirituality, and Religion. It's been a real pleasure working with Dr. Collier and her team on preparations for this event, and we're especially grateful to Professor Snead for his fantastic support. The Bur Oak Foundation is a new scholarly initiative at the University of Michigan. It started with a sincere desire to contribute in a positive way to the academic life of this great institution, the leading public research university in the country. While larger events like this one will certainly be a part of what we offer over time, we believe that our most important efforts will involve personal events on a much smaller scale. One of our goals is to bring together groups of students and faculty from across the disciplines who would like to try to experience college as primarily an occasion to reflect on how to live a good life. We would like to do this through mentoring and small group events, including things like cultural outings, reading groups, and short seminars on topics which share a common overarching foundational question. The theme that we would like to inform our programming is one of anthropology, exploring questions such as what is a human being, what does it mean to be human, and how do the different answers to these questions affect you, the individual student, and society as a whole. Professor Snead's work in this regard is really the perfect launching point to introduce our own aspirations at Bur Oak. We would like to approach these fundamental questions in an interdisciplinary manner, for example, through explorations of art, music, and architecture, by reviewing the development of the notion of conscience and human moral agency over time, and perhaps by discussing the lives of literary figures, philosophers, politicians, people who have had an impact on human history for better or worse. In the fall, Candace Vogler, the Stern Professor of Philosophy at University of Chicago, will be coming to offer her reflections on the importance of the humanities for the formation of STEM students. Her talk will be followed over the course of the semester by talks on the transcendentals, truth, beauty, and the good by local faculty. So if you're interested, please keep an eye on the website for details. We assume that differences of opinion with respect to questions of meaning and purpose are going to happen. That's because they're foundational questions. So as an institution, we're committed to fostering an environment of real friendship, intellectual friendship, where we engage our differences openly, vigorously, and respectfully. All of us searching for the truth without fear and hopefully without self-censorship. So please reach out to me, visit our website, which you can see over my shoulder, or you can email us at buroakfoundation@gmail.com if you have any other questions. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Kristen and we'll start our program.
Thanks, Joe. So now I'm happy to introduce Professor Snead. So Professor Carter Snead is Professor of Law, Director of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture, and concurrent Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. He is one of the world's leading experts in public bioethics. His research explores issues relating to neuroethics, enhancement, human embryo research, assisted reproduction, abortion, and end-of-life decision-making, and has been reviewed or featured in such publications as the Wall Street Journal, New York Post, Bloomberg Opinion, and many, many others. Additionally, he has written more than 60 journal articles, book chapters, and essays. His scholarly works appear in such publications as the New York University Law Review, the Harvard Law Review Forum, the Vanderbilt Law Review, among others. In addition to his scholarship and teaching, Snead has provided advice on the legal and public policy dimensions of bioethical questions to officials in all three branches of the US government and in several intergovernmental fora. Prior to joining the law faculty at Notre Dame, Snead served as general counsel to the President's Council on Bioethics, chaired by Dr. Leonard Cass. Snead led the US government delegation to UNESCO and served as its chief negotiator for the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, which was adopted in October of 2005. And he regularly serves as an expert witness on bioethical matters before federal courts. And in 2016, he was appointed to the Pontifical Academy for Life, the principal bioethics advisory body to Pope Francis. He is also an elected fellow of the Hastings Center, the oldest independent bioethics research institute in the world. And his most recent book, What It Means to Be Human, The Case for the Body in Public Bioethics, was named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the 10 best books of the 2020 year and received the 2021 Expanded Reason Award. Thank you, Carter, for sharing your wisdom with us on a question that is fundamental to everyone. What does it mean to be human? Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Kristen and Joe. It's great to see you. And I'm so excited about both of your programs, Kristen, both yours and the medical school, and the Bur Oak Foundation is very exciting as well. And it's exciting enough that it would bring a Notre Dame faculty member to the University of Michigan to participate in an activity. Of course, I'm joking. Michigan is an amazing school, notwithstanding their football team. And so I'm just delighted to be joining you this evening and be joining you throughout the various seminar sessions that we're going to be having. I gather we're going to be breaking up the themes of the book into sort of modular sessions. And tonight we're going to be talking about the central animating theme of the book, the central animating question and claims of the book, which I cohere perfectly with the aspirations of the Bur Oak Foundation and the work of your own very important program, Kristen. So thank you both, and thanks to your teams. I know how difficult and how time-consuming it is to put these events together. And also thank you to all of the participants who have signed on this evening to join us and on a Thursday night at 7 p.m. Eastern. Some of you are joining from around the world, I understand, and I appreciate your joining us this evening. I look forward to our conversation after my remarks. So I'm going to share my screen with you now, and this should help folks, I think, follow along with my remarks. So the seminar generally, and in particular the talk this evening, will be drawn from the arguments and the claims of the book that Dr. Collier mentioned, What It Means to Be Human, The Case for the Body in Public Bioethics, which was published in October of 2020. The fundamental claims of the book are twofold. One is a methodological claim, and the other is a substantive claim that arises out of the application of the method. So the methodological claim of the book is that the richest and most potent method of analyzing matters of public bioethics, and I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by public bioethics in a moment, is through what I describe as an inductive anthropological inquiry. And that may sound hyper-technical or highfalutin, but it's really not. All it means is to take the law or public policy that you're considering as you find it. So it's an inductive analysis. You don't begin with principles and apply them deductively. You take the facts as you find them, and then you ask an anthropological question, the anthropological question. What is the vision of human identity and human flourishing that anchors and animates the law and policy that's under consideration? So I do that in the book. I ask that question. I'll say it more in a moment about why I think that's the right question to ask when you're confronted with these kinds of issues. But when you apply that method to the areas of public bioethics, and in the book I take up three what I describe as vital conflicts of American public bioethics, although it would apply equally to the international context as well, or in other countries as well. The vital conflicts of abortion, the law and policy of abortion, the law and public policy relating that touches and concerns assisted reproductive technology, and the law and public policy relating to end-of-life decision-making, including assisted suicide. So the substantive argument emerges from the application of the method to those three particular domains of public bioethics. And the substantive argument holds that when you analyze these particular areas in this way, what emerges, what bubbles to the surface through the analysis, what vision of the person that bubbles to the surface is an impoverished vision, an incomplete vision. And it's not an entirely untrue account of human flourishing and human identity, but it's so incomplete as to be dangerous for reasons that I will explain in the course of my remarks this evening and enlarge upon in those particular areas when we move through the other lectures and the other seminar conversations. But what bubbles to the surface, what vision of the person that bubbles to the surface is what social scientists Robert Bellah and Charles Taylor, philosopher from Canada, have described as expressive individualism. It's a vision of the person that captures only a few true things about what it means to be human, important things, but leaves behind and ignores essential other aspects of our lived experience. And as such, it's an anthropological vision that cannot and does not make sense of the lived reality of human embodiment and all the entailments of our embodiment. Our vulnerability, our reciprocal dependence upon one another, and our subjection to natural limits. And therefore, expressive individualism as an anthropology is not suitable. It's not fit as a foundation for public bioethics. It's not suitable as a foundation for laws and policies that are wise, just, and humane. And the reason why is because expressive individualism, as I will explain momentarily, is, to borrow a phrase from Alistair McIntyre, forgetful of the body. It does not take due account of the fact that an essential reality of human life is our embodiment, is the fact that we live and die as, not in, but as bodies. I'll say more about that, obviously, in a moment. So for the talk, I will proceed in the following way. I will offer a brief definition of what I mean by public bioethics, and sort of gesture towards a couple of examples or a couple of the signal events that gave rise to American public bioethics. I'll make the case briefly for why the anthropological analysis of law and policy is, I argue, the best approach, the richest approach. I'll say a little bit more about how that works. Then I will pivot to the anthropology that I believe animates in significant part these areas, these vital conflicts of American public bioethics. That is the anthropology of expressive individualism. And I'll explain why I think it's an incomplete conception of the self that is forgetful of the body, and what the problems with that, what the consequences of that are for law and policy. And then I'll conclude by recommending or suggesting a kind of corrective to the errors of expressive individualism, a sort of anthropological corrective, a kind of plea to remember the body, to incorporate into our anthropology our embodiment, and to take due account of our embodiment as an essential feature of our lives. And I'll talk about what the needs are for and the background conditions that are necessary for the flourishing of embodied beings. And I'll also talk about the goods, practices, and virtues that I think are necessary to support these structures that are essential for both the survival and the flourishing of embodied human beings. Okay, so I'll start with public bioethics. What do I mean by public bioethics? Public bioethics is not merely a field of intellectual inquiry the way bioethics more generally is. Bioethics, of course, is a sort of ethical reflection and inquiry relating to or arising out of advances in biomedical science, biotechnology, and the practice of medicine. What I'm talking about when I say public bioethics is the governance of science, medicine, and biotechnology in the name of ethical goods. It is the work of government. It's the work of the political branches. It's the work of Congress, the work of the White House. It's the work of the courts. It's the work of all the various organs of government, political and judicial at the state level. It is the governance of science, medicine, and biotechnology in the name of ethical goods. So it's not merely reflection on the ethical questions at issue, but it's the point at which the law takes account of these ethical questions and then creates a kind of framework for the regulation or not, depending on what we decide as we govern ourselves in the sphere of different areas of human concern. And I should say that governance and regulation is not a binary process. It is not simply prohibition or permission. It's a wide spectrum of possibilities in terms of the regulatory apparatus that's available in American law and policy. The law can both encourage behaviors, it can reward behaviors through, for example, federal funding. It can punish behaviors. It can seek to deter behaviors. It can even criminally punish behaviors at the most restrictive end of the spectrum of regulation. But between this, the positive encouragement and inducement to particular worthy actions on the one end of the spectrum versus prohibition and punishment on the other end, there is a very fine-grained spectrum of possibilities, including data collection, surveillance, licensure and certification, as well as simply a kind of neutrality where the government sits back and watches and creates private spaces where private ordering can take place. And so when you hear the word governance, you shouldn't think about, wow, we're talking about criminal punishment, or even on the other hand, we're talking about federal funding. There's a vast array of possibilities in terms of governance and regulation. But public bioethics as a form of governance, as a form of law and public policy, is fundamentally concerned with human vulnerability, dependence, frailty, and finitude. It's about procreation and pregnancy and babies and wasting illnesses and devastating injuries, desperate enrollees in clinical trials, fearful patients, the disabled, the elderly, the dying, and even the dead. Put another way, public bioethics is most deeply about the meaning and consequences of human embodiment, the fact that we experience ourselves, one another, and the world around us in, but more properly, as living and dying bodies. So American public bioethics began in the late 1960s. Different scholars and thinkers date the beginning of American public bioethics and bioethics more generally at different points. What I'm talking about is the point at which the law entered into this picture in an unmistakable way. And as a form of governance, public bioethics is a reactive form of governance. It reacts to high-profile scandals. And in the book, I argue, I take three specific examples of public scandals that provoked a response at the government level. The first event, and you can see in the image here, the gentleman with the white lab coat is Henry Beecher, anesthesiologist from Harvard, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, an earth-shattering piece describing and detailing 22 different experiments involving human subjects. All but two involved no securing of consent at all, and many of them, all of them involved troubling, unethical practices, but some of them were outright shocking. For example, the injection of live hepatitis into intellectually disabled children at the Willowbrook School in Staten Island, or the injection of live cancer cells into the elderly patients suffering from dementia at the New York Chronic Jewish Hospital in New York also. He uncovered practices of the most elite institutions and the government itself in the United States under the auspices of research involving human subjects that were shocking and troubling and awakened the US Congress. It awakened the American public to the problem, this particular problem of American public bioethics, and there followed a significant legal and public policy response. So too is the second scandal I discussed in the book, the Tuskegee scandal. It was a natural history study undertaken by the United States Public Health Service. Government employees went into Macon County, Alabama, and Tuskegee, Alabama, one of the poorest parts of the country, and exploited an entire community of African-American sharecroppers and their family by systematically deceiving them about what they were doing and telling them that they were testing them for bad blood and subjecting them to all manner of invasive testing procedures, including spinal taps and, of course, blood draws, without ever telling them what they were doing. And most shockingly, after antibiotics became the standard of care for treating syphilis did not offer that to any of the individuals in the study who were suffering from syphilis. They didn't treat them at all. They wanted to see the ravages of the disease progress unaddressed through this population. And there were reports even that the Public Health Service colluded with local health authorities to prevent these individuals and families from finding out what was going on or where they might get help. And that went on for 40 years. That came to light in the 1970s in a Washington Post expose. And then the third example, and most people probably listening have heard of Henry Beecher's articles and of the Tuskegee scandal, but perhaps folks have not heard about the third scandal that I take up, which is the experimentation on newborns, children who had just been aborted. We're not talking about in utero human beings. We're talking about children who were outside of their mother's body, just been aborted, imminently dying because of the abortion, and a series of experiments that were being performed on these children to extend their lives for the sake of the experiment, and seemingly to increase their suffering for the sake of the experiment. This was taking place in Scandinavia. There were American researchers traveling to Scandinavia to do this. This story came to light in a series of articles in the Washington Post, created a scandal, and there were demonstrations. In fact, Maria Shriver, at the time, a high school student in the Washington, D.C. area, organized a protest to protest this form of experimentation, and went down to the NIH, who claimed that they had not been funding it. I think the record is a little ambiguous on that front. But it also led to and provoked a series of reactions. And these three scandals, the Beecher scandals that he uncovered, the syphilis experiments in Tuskegee, and the live fetus, called live fetus, but it was actually neonate is the more accurate way to describe it, since these were children that were outside the body. It prompted congressional hearings. And Maria Shriver's uncle, Senator Edward Kennedy, convened hearings in the Senate over a period of time, taking testimony on these scandals, focusing on these as well as other matters, and it ultimately culminated in the passage of the National Research Act, which set forth the statutory authority to create a system of federal human subjects protections, but it also created the first national commission on bioethics. And what we see when we think about the history of American public bioethics is that it is a unique form of government. It's complex. It's a seamless integration of great goods with serious and grave risks. It's contested. These are, as Dr. Bouffill said, these are the most fundamental questions that you could possibly discuss. And so people disagree very strongly, and in some cases even bitterly, but because these questions squarely and unavoidably pose the issue of who are we and what do we owe to one another in the most intimate contexts. They are vital conflicts. They're frequently zero-sum matters of life and death. Sometimes the question of the contours and the boundaries of the moral and legal community are presented. And then finally, one of the sort of recurring and unique features of American public bioethics that we see frequently is policymakers, lawmakers, the public, and others, thinkers, trying to seek refuge in autonomy as a grounding good of law and policy. And I think that impulse to seek refuge in autonomy points towards a kind of animating anthropology that is just under the surface, which we'll talk about in a moment. So, since the 1960s and 70s, issues in public bioethics are all over the map. And this list here is merely scratching the surface. I'm listing, and you can see in red the three issues that I take up that I've already mentioned: assisted reproduction, abortion, and end-of-life decision-making. And again, focusing not on individual persons and their motivations, patients and their motivations, but rather the law's presuppositions about what persons are and what they need and what is threatening them. And those presuppositions anchor the doctrinal principles and policies that grow out of them. So why then do I think that law and anthropology are connected to each other in this deep way? And when I say anthropology, just to be clear, I mean, I think it's probably clear from context, but just to be perfectly clear, I don't mean anthropology in its sort of modern academic sense. I mean in its sort of original sense of what it means to be, an account of what it means to be a human being. So the first point I'll make, and this is probably something that a lot of the audience is familiar with, insofar as we have folks who have legal or public policy training. But if not, it's really important for laypersons to understand that law is irreducibly normative. Okay, every law, no matter how banal or anodyne it is, every law is rooted in a particular normative aspiration. Every law aims at a particular good to be pursued or a particular harm to be avoided, which in turn rests on concepts of justice and freedom and equality. It is irreducibly normative. There is no separating law and normativity, law and morality, law and ethics. They are inextricably intertwined. That doesn't mean, of course, that every ethical question, every moral question needs to have a legal response. By no means am I suggesting that. But every law, when you enter into the law itself and you try to understand what's going on and what it's aiming at, you immediately come upon a particular good that is animating that law, and it's essential to understand that good. And so law, because it's grounded in these normative goods, has a twofold pedagogical function. One, it reflects the goods that a given people hold dear or the harms they seek to avoid. Now, I don't normally quote Oliver Wendell Holmes for bioethical wisdom for reasons that we can get into later if you want to, but he was correct for sure when he said that law is the witness and external deposit of our moral life. You can know a lot about a people by what their law says, what they're afraid of, what they hope for, and how they seek to regulate themselves and their relationships to one another. But law doesn't merely reflect or teach us about what a given polity cares about. Law also shapes public attitudes about goods and harms, for better or worse. People take their bearings from what the law forbids, from what the law permits, from what the law encourages. And as I say, that's an imperfect teacher because the law doesn't, thankfully, occupy the entire field of ethics and morality. And sometimes the law, by the way, gets things very badly wrong, frequently when it's grounded in a false and incomplete anthropology. But nevertheless, law is a deep teacher of norms for people, for better or worse. Now, so what then about, so you begin with doctrine and principles and policies, you drill down to the normative level. What is this law aiming at? What goods or harms is it seeking to avoid? You can drill down a little bit further and say, what principles of justice are animating this? What principles of equality and freedom and so forth? But then at the deepest level, at the very deepest level, you have the level of anthropology. And Walker Percy, one of my favorite novelists, said sort of everyone has an anthropology. There's no, and that's true of the law as well. There's no not having one. If a person says he doesn't have an anthropology, all he's saying is that his anthropology is implicit. It's a set of assumptions that he is not thought to call into question. And so, put as simply as I can put it, the reason anthropology is the fundamental, deepest point of understanding of the law and public policy, especially in public bioethics, is because law is about and for the protection and flourishing of persons. That's the most basic way, I think, to articulate what the law is for and what gives it its logic and is the measuring stick against which you can evaluate whether the law is achieving its goals. Law is about and for the protection and flourishing of persons. And as such, it unavoidably rests upon usually undeclared conceptions of what a person is. Now, I'm not talking about the question of when life begins or who counts as a person, although this anthropology is deeply connected to those questions. It's even more basic than that. The question is, who are you and I? Who are we and what consists our flourishing? That is the anthropological question. That is the premise that all law has to rest on for it to meet its intelligible goal. And therefore, the richest and deepest understanding of law is an anthropological understanding, analyzing the vision of human identity and flourishing in which the law is anchored. Who and what does the law assume persons to be? And when you ask that question, and when you train your analysis on these three areas of American public bioethics that I've already mentioned a couple times now, and that we'll take up specifically as we have additional seminar sessions, what comes to the surface, as I said at the outset, is expressive individualism. So what do I mean by expressive individualism? Now, in the book, I won't do it now, but I break down and offer a kind of genealogy of expressive individualism, both in political theory as well as in literature, drawing deeply upon the work of Charles Taylor and others. But there is in literature images of expressive individualism that come into, and Robert Bellah found this in his in his social science research, which he published in 1985, Habits of the Heart, that there's a kind of this vision of expressive individualism, which used to be the domain of artists and writers and literary figures, enters into the common morality, certainly in the United States, in a very strong way in the middle of the 20th century. Just as a kind of teaser, John Milton in Paradise Lost has an amazing scene in which a particular character, Satan, or Lucifer, the fallen angel, is addressing the other army of angels, talking about their own self-understanding. And Satan says, when this creation was, remember thou thy making while thy maker gave thee being? We know no time when we were not as now, no none before us, self-begot, self-raised by our own quickening power when fatal course had circled his full orb, the birth mature of this our native heaven, ethereal sons. Our puissance, our power is our own. Our own right hand shall teach us highest deeds by proof to try who is our equal. That, in a nutshell, is an anthem of expressive individualism. It is the individual who understands themselves as self-made, self-possessed, whose destiny is invented endogenously inside by virtue of consulting the interior of the sentiment. And oneself is abstracted from any other constitutive attachment. There's no recollection or gratitude for one's creation, for those upon whom one depended for his or her survival and for her flourishing or his flourishing. That's just a little teaser, though. So getting back to a kind of discursive account, expressive individualism understands the fundamental human reality as the isolated, unencumbered, atomized self. The fundamental human reality is the self, the individual self, shorn of all attachments, abstracted from all constitutive connections, no respect for, no conception of defining the self with respect to tradition or family or any narrative at all, any constitutive attachments. It's an abstraction, okay? The atomized individual self. And the self is defined by the will, by the mind. And the body is merely instrumental to that, to the objects and desires and goals that are generated by the mind and the will. Okay, so the mind, so it's profoundly dualistic. It divides the human person into mind, which defines you, and the body, which is merely instrumental and accidental. And persons are defined as individual choosers or consumers. It's the exercise of choice that makes one that constitutes one's that constitutes the activity of the individual. And flourishing is the pursuit of projects of one's own construction. That is, you interrogate the self. You think about your own sentiments. You you think about, you reflect upon what's inside yourself. The inner voice, as Rousseau called it, is what is morally definitive. Okay, and definitive of what you should do. And the authenticity and originality that emerges from you is what you are to express. And there's an imperative to live that originality and to project that life plan that comes from inside, outside. And your flourishing, your highest flourishing, is the configuration of your life and activities in pursuit of that internally created goal. Okay. And to use a phrase of Michael Sandel, you are a self-originating source of valid claims. And expressive individualism is profoundly, to borrow another philosophical phrase, anti-teleological. It doesn't take external givens. It doesn't take the external given of the body. It doesn't take the external given of nature or the world around us as a useful guide to understanding ourselves or the world around us. We are, and what you see in the image there is a tabula rasa, that is, we are a blank slate. We can invent our own future. We can invent our own identity, and we are not bound by relationships, attachments, tradition, our bodies, the natural world. Only the unique and original inner voice is definitive. External givens are not normative, and they're not really even a distinctively useful guide to negotiate and understand the world. Truth comes from inside. It's not outside. And it's also a vision of the person and human flourishing that doesn't recognize unchosen obligations and I've already said constitutive attachments. No one has a claim on me. No one can bind me to them without an act of will, an act of consent. There's no one to whom I owe an obligation just by virtue of our relationship, by virtue of who we are. There are no unearned privileges that I have that I can make claims on other people, absent a kind of transactional encounter. And relationships, personal relationships, are viewed as instrumental and transactional, ultimately to the highest good of pursuing one's own internally created future. And that doesn't include just relationships among strangers. That includes relationship with family members as well. Instrumental and transactional. And person, now it's good because I'm going to borrow a phrase from a wonderful professor of the University of Michigan, Carl Schneider, who teaches in the law school, who has this fantastic phrase that he used in an article many years ago, that that this focus on individualism and rights talk leads in the clinical context to patient abandonment, in fact. And persons encounter one another as isolated adversaries clad in the armor of their rights. Expressive individualism reduces ethical goods fundamentally to autonomy, the highest good to which all other goods are subordinated. It's about freedom of a very particular kind, the freedom to pursue my dreams as I see fit, the freedom to define for myself the mystery of life, the meaning of life, and to assert my unencumbered will in pursuit of those goals in a manner without encumbrance from others, from the law, of course, and perhaps even from natural encumbrances. And injustice is reconceived as constraint on this freedom to pursue projects of my own choosing. And the role of government and social life becomes focused on the removal of constraints, public constraints, private constraints, perhaps even natural constraints, and otherwise provide the conditions for the assertion of the unencumbered individual self. Now, this is a very sexy image, right? The lone, atomized individual will bestriding the universe, imposing his will, bending nature to his will, encountering other selves, sometimes coming into collaboration with those selves when we have mutually beneficial goals. But once those mutual goals are no longer shared, we break apart those relationships. But also it's a world of strife, right? You not only do you collaborate with other atomized wills, you also have to overbear those wills. You have adversaries that you encounter and have to overbear. So it's a kind of it's a world of strife and of violence in some ways. But it's sexy, right? Like the idea, and you could imagine someone being very drawn to that. Someone, back to the Milton passage, you can imagine being very drawn to the idea, non serviam. I don't owe anybody anything. The only person that I have an obligation is to be true to myself and to follow my dreams and follow my truth as I've conceived it, which is original, maybe transgressive, but that's okay because it's my truth. So it's very appealing in some ways. It appeals to a kind of our baser instincts. It may be especially appealing to Americans who have a kind of gravitational pull to rugged individualism in this way. But it's ultimately false. It's ultimately not true. Why is it not true? It's not true because it has no account and cannot render intelligible the fundamental reality of our existence as living beings on Earth, and that is to say our embodiment, our existence as living, corruptible, finite, fragile, dependent bodies. It can't make sense of that because it only understands the person as a will, as an individual will. And if you were to, and it's false because there's almost no one that actually satisfies this image of the autonomous will, unencumbered will, bestriding nature and one's domain, imposing one's will, bending things to one's will. I mean, on the arc of human development, we begin in a condition of complete and utter dependence. And if everything goes as well as it possibly could, we gradually increase in our powers by virtue of the support and the beneficence of others up into a point where we reach the height of our powers. And perhaps expressive individualism assumes a kind of anthropology that's a snapshot for the very most privileged and successful individuals, the smallest sliver of the most privileged among us, at the very height of their powers. Maybe that's an image of, that's the image of the person in expressive individualism. But even for those people, even for those very fortunate people, they immediately begin to decline once again, up back towards, again, all things being as going as well as they possibly can, complete and utter dependence once again. And it's because of embodiment. Our lived embodied realities, because we are fragile, corruptible bodies in time, we are vulnerable. We are mutually dependent, therefore mutually dependent on one another. We are subject to natural limits of aging and injury and illness. And as McIntyre points out, we are all, every one of us, exist on a scale of disability, whether it's a snapshot in time or disruptions in our agency because of injuries or illnesses. We are all dependent upon one another by virtue of our frailty in our embodiment. And so what is it that embodied beings need? They don't need the facilitation of the exercise of the unencumbered will. And if you design law around that presupposition that that's what they need, you're going to design a law that leaves behind an enormous amount of very vulnerable people, okay? What people need, embodied beings need, are what McIntyre calls networks of unconditional and uncalculated giving and graceful receiving. That is what you and I need, A, to survive. None of us would be here right now if someone didn't take it upon themselves to make our good their good without seeking anything commensurable in return. And usually it's our parents. That's normally the sort of the primordial network of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving is the parent-child relationship. And everybody who can hear my voice right now is alive and well today because someone else took care of you. But it's not merely for our basic survival. It's also, and this is a normative claim I'm making, it's for our own flourishing. It's to become the thing that we, I argue, are meant to become. That is to say, to become the kind of person who can make the good of another our own good without seeking anything in return. What it means to be human is to care for one another. What it means, both because it's essential, the networks are essential for survival, but they're also essential pedagogically to teach us the thing that I argue we're supposed to become. In short, I argue that by virtue of our embodiment, we are made for love and friendship, not for assertion of the unencumbered will. And so expressive individualism as an animating anthropology for law and policy is myopic. It can't recognize the unchosen claims of the weak, including children, the disabled, and the elderly, reminiscent of something Bertrand Juvenel said about certain social contract theorists. It's a chartered libertarianism for the strong, expressive individualism. It leads to loneliness and dislocation and alienation because you can't form constitutive attachments, as Michael Sandel has pointed out. If you can't have a narrative, a defining narrative that includes constitutive attachments, then you are radically alone and no one can even understand your wishes and desires and hopes and dreams and others can't understand yours. But not only that, you can't even understand yourself, right? By its own metrics, expressive individualism requires other people to be present, to hear your expression, to measure yourself against, to react against, to define yourself in a dialogical way. That's missing from expressive individualism. You have to supplement it with this other idea. Expressive individualism as an animating anthropology also leads to a death-haunted life. When you are the fixed point, the only point in the universe, as Solzhenitsyn says, your death constitutes the extinction of the entire universe at a stroke, and that is a very heavy thing indeed. And not to mention the practical concern that expressive individualism, if really embraced, leads to the erosion of social and familial ties. And Robert Bellah found this in his social science work as well. So it is a deeply problematic thing to anchor the law in a conception of the person that is as myopic and incomplete as expressive individualism. It is, in fact, deadly for the weakest among us who are not even visible to the eye. The eye of expressive individualism can't even see or make sense of the individuals who cannot act according to their will: children, the disabled, the elderly, the unborn. So what do we do? So what I argue we should do, in looking to McIntyre and others, is that the corrective here is we have to remember the body. We have to embrace these networks, the construction of, and take responsibility for these networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving. And that means practicing certain kinds of goods and virtues for lived embodied reality. So again, we have to learn to recognize and participate in these networks that I've already described to become the kind of person who can make the good of another your own good, to learn to see the vulnerability through the practice of memory and the cultivation of moral imagination, to be able to see the other who has a claim on you despite the absence of a contract, despite the absence of consent. Parents and children, for example, don't live in the synergistic relationship because they have a contract. Parents don't take care of children, their own children, because they have a contract or they think that it's some beneficial to them in some way to do so. It's intrinsic to the relationship itself. And the child doesn't have to earn the right to be cared for by his or her parents. It's simply intrinsic to the relationship itself, but expressive individualism can't see that. And you have to cultivate your moral imagination to see the others who you are connected to in these networks of giving and receiving. Because you can cultivate and live according to the illusion that you are in fact here on your own power and not accountable to others. So in order to shore up and create these networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving, we have to practice certain kinds of virtues. McIntyre calls them the virtues of acknowledged dependence. I've included some of the virtues that he cites. I've added a few as well. The virtues of acknowledged dependence, first of all, are the virtues of uncalculated giving. That includes just generosity. Which means giving to other in proportion to her need, notwithstanding your expectation of getting anything in return. The only thing that animates your giving is the need of the other. Hospitality, welcoming the other because he or she is a stranger, not because you're hoping to get something in return, but because that's what you do for strangers. And misericordia, and this is especially important for physicians. Misericordia is the virtue of taking on the suffering of another as if it were your own suffering. And that means trying to heal and to comfort others. But when that's not possible, to merely accompany them in their suffering. Alongside the virtues of uncalculated giving, we have the virtues of graceful receiving. Chief among them is gratitude. The idea that we recognize that we are not here because of anything that we did. We're here because of other people decided to make our good their good without seeking anything in return. And that gratitude should engender a kind of humility and what others have called a sort of ethic of giftedness, to understand that everything that we have is ultimately reducible to a gift. And we need to treat others and the world around us in precisely that way. And that humility and that ethic of giftedness leads us to be open to the unbidden and to avoid seeking the imposition of rational mastery and imposition of our own will on others, on ourselves, on nature. Theologian Bill May, Protestant theologian from SMU, who retired, I think, to the University of Virginia. Maybe he's retired altogether. I don't know. I saw him a couple of years ago. Wonderful, brilliant man who was on the President's Council on Bioethics. Used this phrase, openness to the unbidden, which is deeply connected to tolerance of imperfection, right? The idea of welcoming, especially in the context of parents and children, welcoming one's child as a mysterious stranger, as a gift to be grateful for, to love unconditionally, not as something to be molded or a canvas onto which we project our own aspirations. The other good of graceful receiving includes solidarity, the acknowledgement that we are deeply connected to each other and we have obligations to one another. The virtue of respect for the intrinsic equal dignity of every human being, regardless of their capacity to do anything for you. People can participate in the networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving merely as passive recipients of unconditional love. That means you don't have to be mindful or capable of cognition even to participate in these networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving. Truthfulness is an essential virtue of graceful receiving. And all of these goods, giving and receiving, I think, are best understood through the lens, and this echoes something that Dr. Boufil said, through the lens of friendship rightly understood. Friendship's understood in its highest Aristotelian sense of making the other, making the good of the other your own good. And we need to develop these virtues by practicing them, practices that take you outside of yourself, that draw your gaze up from inside to looking outside. And the paradigm, and it's certainly not the only opportunity or paradigm of practicing these virtues but is important and essential to the things we'll be talking about later on in the seminar, is parenthood itself. And outside of that deep, intimate relationship, participation in communities of memory, a phrase that Robert Bellah used to describe communities that were animated by goods that were beyond the narrow self-interest, the narrowly defined self-interest of the individuals themselves. So I've been going on for too long. I will stop there. And this framework that I've articulated and this methodology and these conclusions, I hope we'll be able to see how they play out in a concrete way. They'll seem less abstract to you when we get into the subject matter areas of abortion, assisted reproduction, and end-of-life decision-making. And again, to specify, I'm talking about the law. I'm not talking about people. I'm not talking about people's judgment or motivations or self-understanding. I'm talking about what the law presumes human beings are, and by extension, what they need. So I will stop there, and we can open the question and conversation portion of the evening.
Awesome. Thanks, Carter, so much. Okay, so we have a few questions. A first question is from Gabriella, and she says, it would seem that modern society is attempting to straddle both an expressive individualism and a strong sense of duty to society via taxes and government programs, climate responsibility, et cetera. Vaccine mandates may be a good example of this, in the sense that it doesn't bend to the individual, but rather acts in favor of society over the individual. Is it sustainable to maintain these dueling views, and how do we address the desire to apply different views to different aspects of governance of our lives?
Yeah, it's a very complex question, and there's a lot going on in that question, and I appreciate it very much. Here's what I would say. I think, and the good news is, in the areas in which the law currently permits us to have to be in conversation with each other and to deliberate with one another about how we're going to govern ourselves on these complicated questions, I think it behooves us to call things by their right names and to be very explicit about what is driving our consideration here. So, for example, to take the example of pandemic responses, it's important for people to explain why it is and what vision of human identity flourishing is animating their particular proposals and suggestions. And we've seen some of that. And that's useful for wise and humane government. I mean, people say, I don't want to wear a mask because I don't want to be encumbered by that because it's inconvenient to me, or I don't feel like it's necessary for me, or I don't want to get vaccinated because my bracketing the other ethical questions involving the production of vaccines. I don't want to be vaccinated because I don't want to, I'm not at risk, right? I'm perfectly healthy. I'm not at risk, and not engage. And so those, you can pretty quickly, if those are the two arguments, and I'm bracketing a lot of complexity involving the vaccine debate. There's a lot of complexity, and people on both sides, pro and con mandate, have important points to make. And I'm not suggesting an answer to those disputes, but I'm saying for the hypothetical person who simply doesn't want it, not because they have concerns about the origins of the vaccine or because they're concerned about safety involving the vaccine or how if it's been tested appropriately or not, or people who are embracing natural immunity as an alternative. I'm not talking about any of those folks. I'm talking about the person who says just very straightforwardly, I'm not at risk, so I don't want to do it. That there's a kind of anthropology behind that. That strikes me as a kind of, or even more so, I don't want to do something that is inconsistent with my own self-narrative. I don't want to wear a mask. I don't want to have a vaccine because that's inconsistent with what I understand I am and what I want to be in my own future. That looks like an argument that's rooted in expressive individualism. And in the conversation that we can have, it seems important that we surface that, because the person might not even realize that that's what they're saying. You know, there are plenty of people who I think would reject expressive individualism who might be tempted to that kind of a view. And perhaps it could be instructive for that. And here's the flip side, right? You could imagine people saying, okay, it is a pandemic. We have to shut everything down, lock everything down. We have an elderly couple who've been married for 75 years. We have to separate them. They can't be together. There can be no human contact. We're going to put a surgical glove filled with warm water on someone to simulate human touch. There's a kind of overreach, it seems to me, in that framework as well. It's not taking due account of human relationships and the kind of obligations we have to one another. That's not simply to avoid all risk in the world, but also perhaps there's some things, marital fidelity, marital intimacy, family, and freedom that we in some cases should counterbalance our single-minded focus on preventing the spread of disease. So I think in these conversations, it would behoove us to surface in the conversation the kinds of fundamental goods that are driving us, because sometimes they're mysterious even to people themselves. You can find yourself being drawn in. Why do I hold this particular position? I think that's essential for healthy self-governance.
Thanks, Carter. We have a question from Joseph, who says, Thank you for everyone for making this possible. A question I'd love to hear more about. How does the anthropology of embodiment confer or constitute the equal moral worth of all humans? I'm thinking of the debate surrounding moral status and what features constitute full or partial moral status, personhood, membership as a part of the moral community. Does the anthropology of embodiment rely on, say, the human properties, theories of moral status? Thank you so much.
That's a great question. And we're going to talk a lot about that when we get to the abortion context. And I'll just say for now, I don't want to articulate what we're going to get into pretty deeply, but I will say that an anthropology of embodiment is very skeptical of standards and tests that try to divide the world of human beings up into who counts and who doesn't count, according to standards that look an awful lot like the things that are valorized by expressive individualism: cognitive functioning, decision-making, the possibility to formulate and pursue desires. I mean, if you look at and we will look at the sort of foundational literature in abortion, abortion philosophical reflections that anchor the abortion jurisprudence, you have people who are saying what it means to be a human being and draw the distinction between personhood and human beings. A personhood is a subset of the family of human beings. It's the subset that is capable of doing the things that expressive individualism valorizes: the capacity to formulate and pursue future directed considerations, the capacity to communicate. You think about Marianne Warren's sort of criteria for personhood, or Michael Tooley, or for that matter, you can look at those who argue not about personhood, but rather about what we owe to one another in turn through the lens of dependence. More dependence means you're less entitled to the protection of the law. The fact that you're making kind of imposition on another person is sort of prima facie evidence for the fact that you're doing something that should be stopped, right? But basically, the anthropology of embodiment begins with is a kind of idea that takes as universal our existence as finite, fragile bodies, and draws out from that how we stand in relation to each other in terms of chosen and unchosen obligations, and a fundamental principle of participating in the networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving is that when you're doing it the right way, you're making the good of another person your own good solely for the sake of that person's good. You're not trying to evaluate that person. And fundamentally, and when we drill down into the context of embryo research and abortion and certain kinds of end-of-life questions where we're dividing the world up into persons and non-persons, fundamentally what we're doing is we're dividing the world up in that way according to the interests of the strong. We're dividing the world up according to the interest of people who can do the things that create the criteria for what constitutes a person. The people making those criteria are the people that can do those things. And so there's a kind of fundamental, I think, injustice sort of out of the gate with the project itself. So it's not the case that the anthropology of embodiment comes up with a criteria for personhood. It rejects that exercise altogether and suggests that if you're a human being, you're part of the human family.
So Carter, just to follow up on that, because I've heard people talk about this category, which I'd never really heard before until I started listening to folks like you and Charles Camosi about this category of like human non-persons.
Oh, yeah.
So what you're saying, you just to be clear to the audience, you reject that category altogether?
Absolutely. Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's there's no living human being that is not I mean, the word personhood itself is in some cases, I mean, it seems like it's a concept that's designed to exclude certain human beings from the moral and legal community. You're shrinking the moral and legal community by saying there are pre-personal human beings that can't do the things yet or don't have the active capacities yet that we think define personhood. Those unborn children, embryos, and so on. And then there are post-personal human beings, people who have lost the capacity to do the things to satisfy the criteria that are set forth by advocates and proponents of personhood theory. So no, I think the only use of personhood that I've ever come across in the context of public bioethics is as part of an exercise to narrow the circle of the moral and legal community. And I think we should be doing precisely the opposite.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a question from Dr. Sloan. So Dr. Sloan says, there's a tension I see between the assumption that humans are autonomous wills and the counterforce today between genetic and scientific determinism being put forth by a strong artificial intelligence that sees humans as simply stimulus response mechanisms to be governed by computer analogies. In this case, there was no will at all involved. How would you respond to this issue?
No, I think and if that's Phil Sloan, who's my dear friend
It
from the
is.
University of Notre Dame,
Sloan.
it's always delightful to have him participate in any conversation. He's one of the most learned people I know on questions of history and philosophy of science. It's great to have him participating. He's put his finger on a paradox, because a lot of the people who are most energetically defending the proposition that autonomy is the only ethical good that matters are in the next breath saying, oh, by the way, there's no such thing as free will, because all we are biochemical, our behavior is entirely determined by biochemical responses, which are ultimately definable in terms of physical relations between particles and relationships of motion and rest and sort of past states of the world. So, I mean, you can't have both, right? Autonomy is a mere illusion if there's no such thing as free will. And there's and I think many of the same people who most energetically advocate for autonomy as the sort of fundamental ethical animating good and expressive individualism also hold the contradictory view that in fact we're not capable of free choice.
Thanks, Carter. There's a question here from my husband, Tim, that I think is an interesting question. I'm just going to take it as moderator's choice. So Tim says, you mentioned that the anthropology of embodiment includes even the dead. What legal public bioethics do you have in mind here? We'd love to hear you expand upon this idea of anthropology applying even to the dead.
Yeah, what I had in mind immediately, and there may be other examples as well, is the definition of death, because being dead is a clinical status, but it's also maybe even more importantly a legal status. And the definition of, and we have debates over the definition of death, and the current definition, or there are multiple definitions in each state, but they're loosely based, all of them, on the Uniform Definition of Death Act, which defines death kind of as alternatively either the irreversible cessation of all cardiopulmonary function or the irreversible cessation of all brain function, including the brain stem. So it's total brain death or total cardiopulmonary death. Irreversible irreversibility is an essential element of that definition. Well, there is and has been and still is a kind of push in the direction of revising the definition of death to be to a sort of neocortical standard, to define it not simply as the total irreversible cessation of all brain function, including the brain stem, but merely those parts of the brain in the neocortex that are associated with the kind of behaviors that are valorized and embraced and are definitive of expressive individualism. And so the idea that we would define, in some ways, is a variation in a way on the theme that we were just talking about. It's not like when does life begin, but when does death begin, is in some ways animated by this question of how we think about what a human being is and what human flourishing is. And those who have argued forcefully for a neocortical definition of brain death, I think are embracing a kind of expressive individualism, because they are taking as the standard the very kind of things that are essential for flourishing and expressive individualism. It defines what a person is in that way.
Thanks. We have a question from Andrew Old. Another question related to the virtue of gratefulness for gifts received. How do we rationalize where the gifts we have received have been generated by historic injustices, such as stolen and redistributed lands as a result of colonization, et cetera?
Yeah, and that's a very serious and important question, right? In the chain of causation, everyone benefits from some evil action in the past, it seems to me, whether you're talking about the unjust taking of land, or this came up very much in the vaccine debate, right? Like the question of whether or not you can use a vaccine that was tested or derived using products that were or cell lines that were at their origin derived from fetal remains of an unborn child that was deliberately aborted. There's a lot in that. We're not going to get into that, but this idea of, how do you avoid cooperating with evil, either formally or materially? But also, it's not just about cooperating with ongoing evil, but I think Kathy Caveney, former Notre Dame law colleague, talked about the appropriation of evil. And there's a kind of trepidation, there's a kind of honesty that we all have to and part of realizing that you stand in this chain of causation in which wicked things in the past are the but-for cause of your current state. You have to think carefully about what you owe to those original victims. And at the very least, you owe honesty, and you owe the kind of, to be honest with them and to be honest with yourself, and to think carefully together about how we can, especially when these are past injustices and the people are long gone, and there's no sort of practical way to remedy the wickedness. What exactly do you have to do? I mean, you can bear witness in a prophetic way. You can acknowledge that you were the beneficiary of some wrongdoing in the past. You can resolve. You can erect barriers to the repetition of those kinds of injustices. And I'll just to bring it back to bioethics. This is something we grappled with very much at the President's Council on Bioethics on the question on the federal funding of human embryonic stem cell research. President Bush articulated a policy on August 9th, 2001, in which he said, the federal government will not create incentives for the use and destruction of living human embryos. And we will nevertheless try to promote science and clinical applications of that science by using federal funding on those forms of research that don't create such incentives. So using the funding for adult stem cell research, or now induced pluripotent state stem cell research. But regarding embryonic stem cell research, his solution, whether it was satisfying or not, but he was thinking in these terms. He was thinking about these embryos who were destroyed in the past through an act that he considered to be an injustice, right? From their deaths were derived these embryonic stem cell lines. And so the question is, can you benefit from these? Can you support research involving these embryonic stem cell lines when they were derived in this unjust way? And he came to the view, and again, this may not be satisfying to the listeners, but this is an example of someone grappling with the question that was raised, saying, and we lay this out in the report, Monitoring Stem Cell Research by the President's Council on Bioethics. You can look it up. I think it came out in 2004. You can still read it online. Georgetown has archived our old website. You can read all the reports, all the transcripts of the prior meetings. And what President Bush came to the view that if you declare the wrongness of the original bad act, if you resolve not to do it in the future, if you erect barriers to the repetition of that bad act in the future, then you can, with trepidation, benefit from and appropriate the fruits of that prior bad action. That was his position. That was his approach to that question. And as I say, it provoked a lot of debate and discussion, and some agree with that, some don't agree with it, but it's a nice bioethics example of what was of the topic that was just asked about.
Thanks, Carter. We have a question from Dr. Christian Vrokler, who's one of our transplant surgeons here at Michigan. He says, thanks so much for drawing so much of the work of McIntyre. He's my hero. This is a horrible question.
He just turned 93, by the way, this week. So happy birthday, Alistair McIntyre.
Oh my God, I still can't believe what a wonderful talk he gave at your fall conference in November. He's just a gem. So Christian says, this is a horrible question, but I would love to hear your thoughts on brain death. So very relevant, obviously, for a transplant surgeon, right? Does your view require continuing medical interventions on those who fulfill brain death criteria? I buy all your arguments, but I don't see reasons to continue medical interventions on patients who have lost all brain function. Can you elucidate how we can thread this needle?
So all brain function, meaning including the brain stem, I assume. Yes, that's the, well, I'll take that as a premise of the question, right? That is, if you meet the standard for brain death, that means it's irreversible cessation of all brain functioning, including the brain stem. And so we actually did a report on this too at the President's Council called Controversies in the Determination of Death. Obviously, there's the famous Harvard report, and there was a report by one of our predecessor commissions. But we tried to grapple with the question, and our work that we did on organ transplantation also grappled with this question, the dead donor rule and other considerations. And I find, and what the position that the council took, and I find it persuasive, I know others don't, and I'm open to being corrected on this, but the position is, I think that what defines a living being as an organism is the integrated coordination of all the parts of the whole, okay? And in the embryo, what integrates the parts of the whole is the genetic and epigenetic factors at work. But in the full-grown human organism, what integrates the somatic functioning of all the individual constituent parts into a unified whole is in large part the brain and the brain stem. That was the argument. And again, I'm not a scientist or a physician. I'm basing my argument on the findings advised by our science advisors, the President's Council on Bioethics. I know that there are people, and this actually, there are people like Alan Schumann who disagree and would say, no, in fact, the brain stem is not the central organizing, coordinating feature of the organism at that stage, and he has interesting examples, and those examples are contested by other physicians and so on. But nevertheless, if it's true that the brain stem and the brain are the coordinating function of the organism, and when they irreversibly cease to function, what happens is the dissolution and the disorganization. And that's what constitutes the death of the organism. That was the position of the President's Council on Bioethics, and I found that definition persuasive.
Thanks. And I just want to say I called Christian a transplant surgeon, but he's a pediatric craniofacial surgeon. It's still important questions for our surgeons to ponder. Thanks, Carter. We have an interesting question about disability theology or disability studies from Professor Sarah Hundren. And Sarah says, thank you, Professor Snead, for your book and tonight's talk. Could you tell us whether and how your work is nourished by scholarship in disability studies? That tradition is so useful in building the moral imagination you speak of, histories of the atypical body, rich alternative forms of language and communication, and culture that show the dignity of the body and all its variations, plus the barriers to flourishing in a world built for the hyper-individual. I'd love to know whether thinkers in that scholarship inform your own.
Yes, I need, and I would appreciate the questioner to send me a bibliography of works that she thinks are especially important. I mean, I rely very heavily on the work of Stanley Hauerwas, who himself has thought very deeply about persons with disabilities and how to love persons with disabilities the right way, and how to think about their configuring a society in which that doesn't exclude them from it. And one of the things that I work on, and something that's very close to my heart, is our children with Down syndrome, and all the different difficulties that they encounter, both before and after they're born, in our society. And I would direct, and Lisa Schultz, who is a law professor at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, has informed my thinking a lot. Bishop Comensoli from Australia has written a beautiful book on disabilities, which I think is great. But I'm quite sure that I'm only scratching the surface of the literature on disabilities, and I would be very grateful for someone to point me in directions of even more scholars and thinkers, because I think it's absolutely essential, and the premise of the question is very, very close to my heart.
I would just like to point out someone who does cool work in this space, who's a younger person that might need some lifting up. Sarah Barton, who's at Duke Divinity. We had her speak for our program a couple years ago in disability theology, and she does great work. So anyone interested in Sarah Barton's work, she's at Duke. We have a question from Richard Derflinger, and Richard says,
"Oh, I know him."
Yes, he's a good friend of the program. So I think to some extent, Richard says, expressive individualism arose as a reaction against religion. Can the alternative anthropology highlighting an obligation to make the needs and suffering of others our own be persuasively defended without appealing to religious belief?
Well, that's what I try to do in my book, and I don't appeal to religious belief in my book. I try to, again, I begin with as I say, the proposition about what law is for, and then I talk about and the essential role that anthropology plays in the construction and the implementation of law, and then I talk, and then I offer a competing anthropology of embodiment that does not explicitly draw upon religious sources, certainly not revelation, but is, I think, compatible with religious belief, and certainly the traditions that I'm familiar with and that I'm a part of. And so I would hope that, in fact, it would work in a funny way, in a different way. I would hope that people who would be inclined or sympathetic to the arguments of the book might, who are indifferent to, or perhaps even hostile to religion as they understand it, might might find common ground with folks who are religious, who are operating from a religious worldview and norms of their particular faith. It might be an opportunity for people to see eye to eye. But I intentionally wrote the book in a way that was not rooted in a religious. But I will say that in the genealogy I talk about, it's not just religion that expressive individualism is reacting to. That's certainly true of the Romantic poets, Byron and others. But it's really more the notion that people were defined by their roles, right? Their roles in a given community. That was definitive. It was a kind of reaction, I think, to that. And there's a lot. I mean, that's a vast oversimplification, of course. Read the chapter on genealogy and other people who've done work on this, who've tried to examine the question of where this comes from. Expressive individualism. Carl Trueman, a theologian at Grove City, I think, is where Carl teaches. Great guy. Wrote a very thick book on the same topic. Came out a little bit after mine, and does a kind of deep dive into interesting origins of expressive individualism. But I take Richard's point, and it's always good to listen to Richard when he talks.
Thanks, Carter. We have time for a couple more questions. This is a question from Guillaume. If an entity's value is not dependent on having an internal will, how should we determine which entities are morally valuable? I'm particularly curious about how non-human animals fit into this framework of giving and receiving, where you argue that consciousness is not critical to moral value.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so my position, and sometimes the question comes up in a sort of an accusation. That's not what Guillaume is suggesting, of course, but an accusation of what some have described as speciesism, right? Like why do you prioritize and privilege human beings over our non-human animal friends or even the natural world itself, right? Like why are you striving? And my answer is I don't actually have a good answer to figuring out. I'll put it a different way. I think of our obligations to animals and the natural world not as a function of the boundaries of the moral and legal community, like a river is a person or a pig is a person or something like that, or isn't a person, but rather I think you can think about what stewardship of animals and treating animals in the world around us in a humane way means for our own our own identity as human beings who are just and humane, and that it actually has an adverse effect on us when we treat animals with cruelty or the world around us in a irresponsible fashion. So I don't have a theory of personhood of any kind that it rules in all of human beings and then rules out animals. But I'm lucky because I'm not a philosopher. I'm actually a lawyer and a legal scholar, and in some ways I take the law as I find it, and we'll have it. But I will say my next book length project, is to grapple with the question of how do we recognize who is one of us? And I'm going to be taking the cases of sort of synthetic human beings, or sort of artificial embryos, which is a hard case. The harder case of animal-human chimeras, which is an interesting way into the question that was asked. And then finally, the question of the hardest questions, or the modular person, like the organoids, like cerebral organoids. And so I'm still in the very beginning stages of thinking about that. But my own way of thinking about animals in the natural world around us is through the lens of stewardship. That is to say, we don't, in the same way that we don't, as expressive individualism, bend the world and nature to our will. We actually, part of our story is our environment and the animals around us. And I think we have, and we don't own them. And in the sort of deepest sense, we have an obligation to care for them and use them in a responsible way and in a respectful way. And I think that my thinking, is sort of just beginning on that front. But I will say this one last point. Sorry to go on about this. You don't have to have a theory of who counts among the natural world or the animal kingdom to be able to start small and say, well, one thing I'm very confident in saying is that every human being is equal to one another just by virtue of their membership in the human family. And that doesn't say anything about how to treat animals or or the natural world. But I don't think there's a contradiction between still thinking through and puzzling through how to best articulate our obligations to the natural world and non-human animals, and defending vociferously the intrinsic equal dignity of all human beings.
Thanks. And I just, for those interested maybe in reading about this more, Professor Charles Camosy wrote a book called For the Love of Animals, Christian Ethics, Consistent Action. He's a moral theologian, bioethicist. It's a very short, easy to read book, very, very, very insightful.
Yeah, Charles is great.
We have a question from Dr. Evan Beacom, who says, in incorporating embodiment into our anthropology, culturally, legally, maybe clinically, I wonder if we talk enough about the embodied property of spatial extension. From biology, we derive familiar obligation. From susceptibility to weakness and illness, we derive obligations to the ill and disabled. From mortality, we derive care for the dying and the dead. Might there be a greater role for moral obligations derived from literal proximity of persons, often unbidden in our public bioethics? The Good Samaritan, the clinical encounter, the idea of neighborliness come to mind as instances in which proximity alone is determinative for moral obligations.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. And I agree with that. There's an interesting, I mean, that runs counter to a very troubling tradition in Anglo-American common law of torts, the sort of no duty to act rule, the no duty to rescue another person rule. American law has embedded in it. Marianne Glennon's talked about this, Roscoe Pound talked about this as a kind of an individualism in the bones of American law and public policy. But I completely agree, and I think that I think that's also a good place to start with the moral imagination. That is proximity. The person in front of you is the person to whom you owe and lawyers and others are always tempted to kind of grand solutions, sort of top-down solutions, when in fact, the place you start is with the person that's right in front of you. And as Mother Teresa said, there's no such thing as mercy from a distance. Like it involves a kind of encounter that is essential. And so I would argue, contrary to the tort law principles that I just articulated, that proximity, and for that matter, your unique capacity to help another person, could itself constitute a source of obligation, right? If the only person that can help is me, then I need to help, right? Like I think that that's an important principle. But it's also important cultivate the moral imagination to be able to see our brothers and sisters that we can't see right up next to us, to imagine people around the world who are suffering from war and famine and hunger and disease, or to see the person or people that we're not acquainted with driving by and seeing a homeless person, across the park, to think about, these are my brothers and sisters. These are people who have a claim on me. We belong to each other, as Mother Teresa said, in a deep way. And so we have obligations that we can't shirk.
So Carter, I mean, just for follow up on that, and you talk a lot, which I think is a beautiful concept to think about. You write and you talk about on your slides here, this cultivation of memory and the moral imagination are crucial means of understanding ourselves more fully and seeing the other to whom we owe obligations of care. John Henry Newman saw imagination also to be at the center of both religious and intellectual life, and something I talked about in my conference paper in medical education. We need to reimagine that. So, but the tricky thing is, I want to sort of maybe push you on this a bit. How do you see this happening? Like, how do we actually cultivate memory and a moral imagination practically here?
Yeah. So, I mean, in the individual case, it's valuable to remember that we are here, as I said earlier, we are here to remember our own utter dependence. To remember our status as utterly dependent on others, and we exist today and will exist in the future, and unfortunately, some of us at many moments in our lives are utterly dependent once again. So, cultivate the moral imagination is kind of imagine that future and the memory of things in the past, relating to the gifts that we've been given, that we have to be grateful for. And it seems to me that in political discourse, that's a valuable thing to talk about. When we govern ourselves, it seems to me valuable to remind ourselves that we didn't invent ourselves, that we didn't build everything around ourselves, that we in fact stand on the shoulders of others and people who maybe whose names we don't even know, who sacrificed for us in this way. So I think political discourse is a way to cultivate memory, but also, I mean, tradition and ritual and different ways of community, different forms of community are ways of preserving memory. And so I think there's a lot we can do. and a lot that we can be incentivized to do, a lot that the law can do to cultivate memory. I wrote a paper called Memory and Punishment years ago, came out in the Vanderbilt Law Review, where I enlarge upon this concept of this sort of humanistic account of memory and what it means for law and public policy.
Very cool. I will check that out. Maybe one last question and we'll close. This is a question about abortion. I don't know if you want to defer till next time, but the question is, Mr. Snead, thank you so much for your talk. If you had a direct line to the Supreme Court justices writing the upcoming Dobbs opinion, would you encourage them to try to insert language reflecting an anthropology of embodiment? And how would you respond to them if they thought this was inappropriate or beyond their role as justices? And further, if they were receptive, how would you recommend they phrase this kind of anti-mystery of life passage from Casey?
Well, we'll talk about that next time for sure. In the meantime, there are a couple things that I would direct the questioner to look at. I drafted an amicus brief with Mary Ann Glendon in which we set forth our understanding of the law in this area and made a case for why it is that both Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey are utterly disconnected both from the text, history, and tradition of the Constitution. The principles of stare decisis don't require those precedents to be reaffirmed. In fact, quite the opposite. It requires them to be uprooted and the question to be returned to the political branches of government. And I'll say that, and there's a sort of, we turned it into an essay for National Affairs, which is available. And then there's a kind of shorter piece in National Review that I wrote about sort of the anthropology at the core. And we'll talk a lot about this, of Roe and Casey and the jurisprudence of abortion being expressive individualism. I think the role of a justice is to interpret in a case like this, is to interpret the Constitution and to apply principles like stare decisis. It's not clear to me, and you would have to see in the constitutional text, history, tradition, or past precedents, some kind of authority for the court to impose an anthropological vision. I think probably, I'd like to think about it more, but I think the more likely outcome is that the more likely pathway that the court should follow is to return the question to those branches of government that have the freedom and the authority to explicitly debate, deliberate, and build in and be principles of anthropology in their lawmaking. So imagine, just to be concrete about it, the Supreme Court, as I think it will do, overturn Roe and Casey. And I'm basing that on my own speculation. I don't have any inside information at all. I don't talk to any of the justices about these things ever. But my own, it's such an obviously correct answer to overturn Roe and Casey, both by virtue of a constitutional interpretation and principles of stare decisis, in my view, that the effect will be it'll return the question to political branches, and we can, for the first time since 1973, seek to govern ourselves in ways that care rightly for mothers and babies and families, and in a way that is consistent with the anthropology of embodiment. And those arguments will be made in the legislative sphere and in the other political branches of government, where there's no impediment, where you're not simply, the goal is not just to interpret a document, but to actually govern unburdened by that kind of obligation.
Friends, we've come to the end of our time together. Carter, thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be able to just hear from you about these very complicated topics and so many rich questions we didn't get a chance to answer today. But thanks everyone for being here. Our next session will be Tuesday, February 15th. We'll be talking specifically about abortion, again at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. In the meantime, if you're interested in learning more about the University of Michigan Program on Health, Spirituality, and Religion, or the Bur Oak Foundation, or want to support our work in those spaces, please contact us. Thanks, friends, and see you next time. Thank you. Thanks, Carter.
Thanks very much.
Joe. Bye, friends.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.